for this very interesting critical comment on the Supreme Court. Everybody please write down your questions. We will open discussion only at the end of it. I now call upon Dr. Uday Shankar, who is Assistant Professor at RGSIPL, which is for Rajiv Gandhi School of International Intellectual Property Law at IIT Kharagpur. He has been awarded with a fellowship from prestigious Max Planck Institute of Comparative Public Law and International Law, Heidelberg in the year 2008. He has participated in law teaching and legal research program at Cardiff University, UK. He led a delegation of students for educational summit to George Washington University Law School. He is member of the International Association of Constitutional Law, South Africa. He has completed a project on Ganga River Basin Management Plan, sponsored by MOEF, Government of India. He has been conferred upon the doctoral degree for his thesis on social and economic rights in India by University of Delhi. He has completed LLB and LLM from Campus Law Center and Faculty of Law, University of Delhi, respectively. His areas of interest are constitutional law, human rights, socio-economic rights, and energy law. He has also authored and co-authored a book, Constitutionalizing Intellectual Property.
Thank you, madam. It's a matter of great privilege for me to speak on this topic in presence of my teachers, Professor Singh and Professor Pandey, including Professor Kumari. Thanks to us for organizing this and bringing all of us here. As rightly said by Dr. Nupur, that we rarely get opportunity to thank our teacher through this kind of academic forum. We generally communicate it personally, so thanks for this. I'll be speaking on socio-economic rights and free market economy because I see close relation between these two. One talks about the ultimate goal, the other talks about the means to achieve that goal. And in this I raise certain questions, and what I'm trying to advocate is at the end of the day, what is important and what has been mandated by the Constitution is we the people should be showered with all the benefits which will make the life dignified. And the course of action which the government decides for ensuring that must commit to the mandate of the Constitution. And that's why I raise few questions and which I try to address in my presentation. That does right requires resources for its realization? Because that is important, because when you talk about economic policy is all about generalization of resources. Who shall manage that? If it's a planned economy, state shall manage that. If it's a free market economy, it is the market which shall generalize the same. So economic policy designs the allocation of resources. So that's what is the primary role of this policy, that how the resources should be allocated. And if that is the case, then whether economic policy influences realization of rights. Because if right requires resources, then the policy must address that. And socio-economic rights inform economic policy and guide social welfare. Whether the formulation of policy should be in the light of the rights which are guaranteed by the Constitution. Now, when you talk about economic policy, what is this area of operation of economic policy and how it gets connected? Economic decision making always deals with the issues of limited resources and scarcity. So that's how we talk about redistribution of resources. That redistribution of resources is very important in order to ensure that everyone enjoys the benefit. And therefore, the policy, what it does is that it enters into the domain where it addresses the issue of limited resources and allowing everyone to draw the benefit. Now, it has been argued that economic policy should focus only on efficiency and growth, and distribution should be left to actors in political domain. So, efficiency should be the only concern of economic policy. Equity should be the concern of political actors. That's what is an argument. Now, what is the argument of free market economy? Those who advocate for free market economy, they say that income inequality provides an incentive for effort and entrepreneurship, and thereby spurs the efficiency and productivity, and the gains from which will trickle down. So if you allow individuals to grow, if you allow individuals to be entrepreneurs, then the individual will grow and naturally the benefit will trickle down to the bottom. And that's why it has been argued that free market economy is going to do greater, benefit. It's going to bring more benefit to the last person who is standing in the queue, which Justice Sikri referred to as marginalized section. So it is said that the economic policy should focus on allocation, but it's the state's function to promote equity and inclusion in the allocation of resources. So it should be inclusive in nature, which was also the point of discussion of Justice Sikri, where it says that inclusive growth should be the agenda. So inclusion in the allocation of resources, where the last person should also be in the agenda of policy formulation, in order to ensure that he should not get deprived. So whose role is it? It's generally been said that it's not the role of the market, it's the role of the state. And the state shall ensure that there shall be inclusion in the allocation of resources. Now this proposition, the one who advocates for free market economy objects. They say that it amounts to intervention. Let the market govern, and let the market address the issue of inclusive growth. So therefore, ownership and control are two important indicators in economy. Who shall own and who shall control? Now when you talk about rights, which I will be discussing, that if ownership lies with the private hand, it addresses, it satisfies the requirement of free market economy. But when it comes to control of the resources, whether 39B and 39C of the Constitution governs the same. As far as ownership is concerned, let it be there with the market. But when it comes to allocation of resources, let it get guided by 39B and 39C. So, drawing connection between socio-economic rights and resources, it has been said, in fact, one of the reasons for categorization of rights between civil and political rights and socio-economic rights has been need of resources. But then this reason of divide has already been adequately addressed with this point that both the group of rights require resources for complete realization, whether it's a civil and political rights or it's socio-economic rights. But there is a difference. Difference is, when you talk about need of resources in realization of socio-economic rights, it involves a question of redistribution. Whereas in civil and political rights, it talks about building of the capacity. So in one case, it is the state which takes up the role to build the capacity, in case of civil and political rights. In case of socio-economic rights, it's all about available resources to be redistributed in order to bring benefit to all. So justifying the separation of directive principles and fundamental rights, because most of the socio-economic rights are given in directive principle. So this is what was said by the Planning Commission, where it says that it is the resources which is at the core for this divide. Because new state cannot undertake the responsibility of realization of socio-economic rights, therefore we must have this divide between fundamental rights which are to be immediately implemented, and directive principles should be implemented in a gradual manner. And that's what even the court says in Monroe Bill. Justice Bhagwati says that implementation will depend on the state of economic development. So resources play important role in realization of socio-economic rights. And then it's not that resources only in terms of money which is important for realization of socio-economic rights. There are different kinds of resources which play important role. So we should not be in this impression that it's only money, it's only the monetary resources which is important. It has been established that there are different kinds of resources which are important. So I'm just highlighting that the realization of socio-economic rights solely doesn't depend on monetary resources. There are like monetary resources, natural resources, human resources, information resources, technology resources. In the context of the Rights of Child Convention, it has been said that organizational is also a resource for realization of rights. So directive principle refers to control. However, as I was saying, that ownership could be with the state or private. So ownership is not a concern here. The concern is that who shall control and how the distribution of resources should happen. Now, when you look at the socio-economic rights and economic policy, how it has been in the history. when I look at the Congress election manifesto in the year 1945, prior to independence, what I find is that the manifesto says that the most vital and urgent of India's problem is how to remove the curse of poverty and raise the standard of masses, and for that purpose it is necessary to prevent concentration of wealth. So 1945, Congress said that we must restrain, we must ensure that the policy should prevent concentration of wealth and power in the hands of individuals and groups. Then again, Nehru proposed that newly born state should be socialist, but then he was very clear in his mind that he is not talking about pattern of economy. What he said is that it is, he said that we have let down not theoretical words and formula, but rather content of the thing we desire. So what he said is that towards the end, the goal should be establishment of egalitarian society, not the pattern of economy which is important. So he said that it's not that when we are advocating for socialist state, we are talking about a particular pattern of economy, we should take us there. And then Syama Prasad Mukherjee, who in response to the objective resolution, what he said is that he talked about this, that unless we have a socialist economy, whatever we are placing, whatever we are committing to our people, we cannot fulfill it. And then, with reference to directive principle, KD Shah observed that every citizen should have the right to compel the state to enforce these obligations by whatever means may found practical and effective. So, again, KD Shah emphasized on this, that obligations by whatever means. So, it is irrelevant that whether it's a socialist pattern of economy or mixed economy or free market economy, what is important is that goal must be achieved. And that's what Dr. Ambedkar says, that we left enough room for people of different ways of thinking with regard to the reaching of the ideals of economic democracy. So that's what was the opinion of Ambedkar, where he says that it's for the government to decide which economic policy it should go for, and that's what is the case even with 25th constitutional amendment. That's what is the case even with 42nd constitutional amendment, which brought in the issue of the insertion of word socialist in the constitution. Then judiciary has been dwelling on the issue of designing of policy in relation to the socio-economic rights. Like in case of Anand Bharati, the Supreme Court said that the framers of the constitution wanted a social structure which would avoid the acquisitive economy of private capitalism. So judiciary has been commenting on, the kind of policy or the formulation of policy. Like in Mahesh Chandra, the court has said that our constitution mandates for mixed economy. Then Ranganath Reddy case, the court highlighted on the word distribute, which is used in 39B, and which says that what it fulfills is restructuring of economic order. It embraces the entire material resources of the community, including the resources with individual. That's what is the highlight. And then in Sanjeev Coke again, the court says material resources of the community means all things which are capable of producing wealth for the community. So when you look at these pronouncements, you can very well make out that in terms of resources, the court has been making this point that it's not only the resources available with the state, but also resources available with the individual should be employed for realizing socio-economic rights of individuals. And in 2010, in Reliance Natural Resources Limited, the court says that it must be emphasized that the ongoing process cannot dispense with the role to be played by the state. So ultimately, the state has got a role. The control should be there with the state. Whether resources lies with the individual or with the state is not very significant for realization. Again, in Dalmia Cement, which is 1996, the court says that these principles, they bind government and all agencies, including private agencies. So even private agencies are to honor, they are also supposed to go by the commitment made in directive principle. And then I am linking it with minimum core obligation, which Delhi High Court has said in 2014 in a case where the court has said that for implementation of socio-economic rights, financial constraint will be immaterial. There are certain obligations which are non-negotiable, and in terms of socio-economic rights, there is certain minimum essential which must be honored, regardless of the financial constraint. The state cannot bring in this argument. And why I am highlighting this, that when you are talking about free market economy, we must have this agenda very clear in mind, that there is something which is non-negotiable when you are talking about socio-economic rights, and it must be fulfilled regardless of the fact that whether resources lies with the state or resources lies with the individual. To sum up, what I say is that economic policy should complement human rights instruments instead of viewing it as a competitive values. They are not competing with each other; they are complementing with each other. And human rights focus on worth of every human being, and so should be the case with regard to formulation of economic policy. And therefore, what I say is that nationalization of resources was justifiable in 1980s for furthering the agenda of directive principles. The redistribution of resources to guarantee minimum core of socio-economic right should be justifiable in the present era. And this is what is the last slide on this, that policy should build around prioritization of minimum essential levels. So minimum core should be the agenda, and resources should be redistributed in order to address that. And exploitative economic system would negate the pledge undertaken by the makers of the constitution in the name of we the people. If economic policy fails to create socio-economic conditions in which there will be an egalitarian social order with social and economic justice to all, so that individual liberty become a cherished value. So it is important that when a formulation of economic policy must address this issue, which is at the core of we the people. And I just conclude by reiterating what Professor Singh has said in one of his papers. That he says that the constitution sets the goal of social justice, but it does not set the economic policies by which they alone will be achieved. So this is what the constitution does not talk about any particular economic policy. And he said that national policies cannot be tested in a court of law. So in a way he brings this argument that the court of law is not the right forum to examine policies, and he said that this job is to be undertaken by vigilant parliament. So that's what, in fact, the makers of the constitution also said while formulating Article 37 and 38. It says that it should be the responsibility of the legislature and the executive to formulate the policies in furtherance of directive principle. That's all. Thanks for listening.
Thank you very much, Uday, for another thought-provoking presentation. And I'm beginning to look forward to the discussion session. I've been provided with all kinds of weapons to make sure that the speakers do not exceed, and I didn't have to use anything. It was just a reminder to that for 5 minutes per more. Now I have the pleasure of inviting Mr. Moez Tundawala, doctoral candidate from LSE, London, School of Economics and Political Science, and he's a visiting fellow at the NLU Delhi. He studied earlier at the School of Oriental and African Studies, London, and the West Bengal National University of Political Sciences, Kolkata. His areas of interest include Indian constitutional and political theory, post-colonial studies, comparative public law, theory of human rights, and Islamic legal theory. You want to speak from here? You want to move? Yeah?
Revered Professor M.P. Singh, other teachers, friends and colleagues, it is a great privilege and a huge responsibility to make a presentation on this auspicious occasion. I hope, sir, I do not end up disappointing you by the end of it. My presentation, I'm a little disoriented because I didn't know about the 15-minute time limit. I had timed myself for 20 minutes or so, but I hope to cover as much as I wanted to within the time allotted to me. My presentation will try to make sense of the constitutional distinction between fundamental rights and elective principles by looking at debates pertaining to the social question in and around the Constituent Assembly. I borrow the expression social question from Hannah Arendt, who makes the provocative claim that the American Revolution was a success because it sought to deal only exclusively with the political domain of freedom, and whereas the French Revolution was a disastrous failure because it tried to find a political solution to the social question of necessity. By necessity, she meant things such as poverty, illiteracy, material destitution. Of course, the Indian anti-colonial movement and the post-colonial moment did not take this assessment seriously. There was a deep engagement with the social question. But nevertheless, we ended up with this divide between fundamental rights, directive principles on the basis of justiciability. And this is what I would try to make sense of. My presentation would be is divided into two broad parts. The first part, I would make a case for moving beyond the paradigm of liberal constitutionalism in order to make sense of the way in which social provisions have come to be structured in the Constitution. In part two, I would look for an alternative conceptualization of directive principles in the constitutional imagination of founding framers and characterize them as simultaneously as incomplete norms and as governmental responsibilities. My core argument would be that it is the reason for this distinction, this constitutional distinction, is not because the directive principles are superior or inferior vis-a-vis fundamental rights, but because the Constituent Assembly wanted to posit government and parliament as the exclusive embodiment of the will of the people. Now to the first part of my presentation, moving beyond liberal constitutionalism. We often start any discussion on directive principles, fundamental rights by saying that fundamental rights are negative liberties, directive principles are positive liberties. Fundamental rights are akin to bourgeois individual rights, whereas directive principles are social and communitarian in orientation. I mean, I will not contest, of course these provisions are, part 3 and part 4 do not lend themselves to such easy classification, but I will not develop this argument over here because of lack of time. What I want to emphasize is what this way of classification alludes to, which I want to problematize. What it does is that it seeks, this sort of a distinction is based on presuppositions of liberal constitutionalism, which my argument is that the anti-colonial movement did not really share. What are these presuppositions? Most importantly being the distinction between public and private. The public sphere is the sphere of the constitutional political domain, that of polis, whereas the private sphere or the homely sphere of oikos is not supposed to be interfered with constitutionally. So what this leads to is a limited government, things such as separation of powers, checks and balances, conferral of individual liberal rights, and so on. Most prominent thinker in this line being John Locke. My argument is that the anti-colonial movement did not share these presuppositions. I use Partha Chatterjee to make the claim that public and private, this distinction was not at all critical in the anti-colonial movement and in the generation of nationalist thought. What he and I agree with him when he says that what was most critical and determinative was this distinction between the spiritual and the material. Moving ahead, I also refer to Sudipta Kaviraj, who makes the point that contrary to Ferdinand Tönnies, who argues that, if whilst moving from the ancient to the modern, this transition is about moving away from community-based forms of association to more society-based forms of association. Kaviraj's point is that the Indian context and post-colonial modernity, the distinctiveness of post-colonial modernity is not in this, but rather the move away from one form of community to another, form of fuzzy, unenumerated community identities to a form of territorial and enumerated community identities. So it is because of all this, the public-private was not critical. Now, the second point that I would want to make over here within this liberal constitutional paradigm, critique of liberal constitutional paradigm, is that the social question was critical to everyone in the founding generation, even before that, during the anti-colonial movement. You pick up any constitutional proposal, be it the officially sponsored by the Indian National Congress, in its resolutions in Karachi, Nehru reports, Sapru report, and so on, and other alternative constitutional proposals which may or may not agree with the Congress position, including most prominently Ambedkar, Jayaprakash Narayan, and Roy, Shriman Narayan Agarwal, who wrote the Gandhian Constitution. Even though they had divergent opinions about Swaraj, all of them converged on at least this one bit, that social transformation was integral to any sort of project of Swaraj. So now, a third point which I would want to make, and very briefly so because we do not have time, is that this new recent trend of thinking about fundamental rights, directive principles as exceptions to fundamental rights. That they are but exceptions which nevertheless have to be celebrated, because fundamental rights, if you apply them, you might lead to unfair and unjust consequences. So you need to have exceptions in the form of directive principles. This sort of an argument you find in the works of Mithil Mukherjee as well as Partha Chatterjee. I do not have the time to engage with them thoroughly over here, so I will move ahead. I mean, my point being that we need to move beyond. The problem over here, which with Mithil and Partha, is that they sort of take liberal constitutionalism, nevertheless, as their starting normative point. But my question is, what if we want to move beyond this liberal constitutional paradigm? I mean, Ashish Nandi in a recent interview said that Indian constitution is a trans-ideological document. So now, how do we try to make a move beyond liberal constitutionalism? Which brings me to the second part of my presentation. Now, looking at some of the debates between opponents and proponents of the divide between fundamental rights and directive principles, I would characterize directive principles firstly as incomplete norms, and secondly as governmental responsibilities. This is, of course, within the constitutional imagination of the founding framers. I am not making it all up. Why do I say incomplete norms? I just said that it is not a good idea to start by saying that directive principles are an exception to fundamental rights, but rather they have some normative potential. But nevertheless, they are incomplete insofar as the courts have not been vested with jurisdiction over them, or they were not vested with jurisdiction over them during the founding moment. Of course, proponents like the official Congress view endorsed by Nehru and Ambedkar. I mean, Ambedkar's point has already been quoted by Prabhash sir and Dr. Uday Shankar as well. So I will not get into all of those things, but just to mention that it is a compulsions of political democracy which they cited while saying that directive principles should not be made judicially enforceable. Opponents, there were many opponents to this lack or incompleteness of treating directive principles as incomplete norms. I mean, Upendra Bakshi has recently said that it is as though there was a suspension or a constitutional suspension or an emergency with respect to the recognition or implementation of directive principles. I mean, even within this line, the most notable remark came from Ambedkar himself at the end of the deliberations in the Constituent Assembly, where he made the famous speech about India entering into a life of contradictions. He said that if you do not take this bit about social and economic inequality seriously, those who are at its receiving end may blow up the edifice of political democracy that we are trying to create. Now, moving forward to the second characterization of fundamental rights as governmental responsibilities. Over here, it is not to say that these directive principles were inferior to fundamental rights, but rather the emphasis on the institutional supremacy of government and parliament, which was sought to be established. It was said that it is a responsibility and prerogative of the government to enforce them. I mean, two things happened as a response. The judiciary was sought to be completely ousted, And secondarily, and more importantly, for my argument, the government in parliament was sought to be made the exclusive embodiment of the will of the people. Now, with respect to the judiciary, there were many conceptual and political reasons as to why they were ousted with respect to having any sort of say in the implementation of directive principles. Most notably, the idea that B.N. Rao mentioned that, there is a possibility that socially beneficent legislations may be vetoed by conservative judges. So it is as though the constitution framers thought of them as agents of bourgeois legalism. On the other hand, the parliament, the government in parliament was was posited as representatives of the people. Ambedkar said that legally these directive principles are not enforceable, but they are salient nevertheless in electoral politics. He very interestingly, he likened directive principles, along both Rao as well as Ambedkar, likened them to instruments of instruction. Instruments of instruction, of course, were given under the Government of India Act 1935 by the monarch to the Governor General and other governors in colonies as well as in India. But what had changed for Ambedkar and others was that these sorts of instruments of instruction were being given now not by the imperial monarch, and were replaced by the constituent voice of the people. So it is we the people who, through our representatives in the constituent assembly, have given these instruments of instruction to the parliament, to the government in parliament. So it was a sort of a colonial governmentality which he sought the continuation of, but nevertheless by trying to democratize it. And this is a very crucial point. Now, what was its consequence for the people? What about people who would not be in a position to participate in electoral democracy, who would not have sufficient collective strength to be recognized as a force to reckon with in electoral democracy? This point was made by Vishwambar Tripathi when in the Constituent Assembly, when he said that, except for the right to vote, the poor man has got nothing under the Constitution. Similarly, Vishwanath Das, who was a Gandhian, also made the same point that the teeming millions have got nothing in the Constitution with respect to social justice, livelihood and health. There was a reason for positing the government in parliament as this sort of exclusive embodiment of the will of people, which was this, that if you remember, at the time the constitution was being framed, the trauma of partition violence was fresh in everyone's mind, and at the same time what was also happening is that you had these insurrectionary politics, a revolutionary sort of politics which was going on, and you had these peasant and labor uprisings and unrest which needed to be curbed. So what did the government do? They enacted and constitutionally sanctioned preventive detention legislations of the same sort that the anti-colonial movement had sought to challenge. Ambedkar, we all know, he said that, this Gandhian bloody methods as well as Gandhian methods of satyagraha and non-cooperation and so on are a grammar of anarchy, and they are not suited for politics in an independent free state. So, and of course, this ties up to a lot of these limitations, many other limitations which were absolute and reasonable within the fundamental rights chapter itself, which made Somnath Lahiri lament that it seems to me that, he said that it seems to me that the chapter on fundamental rights in the Constitution has been designed from the point of view of a police constable. So to conclude, I would want to say that India's engagement with the social question was by no way unique. In European public law, the social question had been deemed to be important by the beginning of the 20th century. Leon Duguay makes this point that older theories of sovereignty had been trumped by social interdependence as the founding postulate of European public law thought. The idea of social solidarity, positive duties to be imposed upon the state and so on had become prominent. But what makes the Indian case fascinating and interesting is that the engagement with the social question was happening under conditions of post-colonial democracy. I had said earlier that using Kaviraj that Indian modernity was not about moving from community to society, but rather from one form of community to another. In the West, what had happened is that civil society was created much before democracy became salient in politics. So, because of which a lot of these radical revolutionary kinds of people, they moved beyond the purview of constitutional politics. So the social became became prominent through the administrativization of the constitution. Whereas in India, interestingly, civil society was created or was sought to be created through the constitution after adoption of universal adult suffrage. So it was, acceptance of this view. The Indian model is about democratizing a colonial governmentality, and because of which, what happened, twofold things which happened, with which I would want to end, is that on the one hand, the government in parliament wanted to invoke democracy, this idea of we the people, and to claim themselves as embodiments of we the people to generate public power. And on the other hand, they also wanted to curb other institutions, I mean, be it the judiciary, be it extra constitutional revolutionary forces, they wanted to curb these other constituent possibilities, which if the judiciary and extra constitutional forces had a role to play in constitutional politics, they wanted to curb or limit or restrict and relegate these other alternative radical constituent possibilities to the periphery, to the zone of illegality or illegality. So simultaneously these two things were happening, and as a result of which, I submit that the framers of the constitution ended up making this division between fundamental rights and directive principles, and saying that it is only the government in parliament which is responsible for its implementation. Thank you.